Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to those on the West Coast. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today, the Dignity in Schools campaign, leveraging federal guidance for making change. We're going to be talking about the 2022 guidance on students with disabilities, IDEA, and Section 504. We have people joining us now. First, and I'll make this announcement, I think again, a second time, we do have interpretation available into Spanish. So I'm gonna pause here and allow the interpreters to introduce themselves and make that announcement.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Me llamo Megan y estoy aquí con María de Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. You have Megan and Maria here with you today from Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. And we will be providing simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea entre el inglés y el español. Si quiere participar en español, escuchar y participar en español, por favor, seleccione el canal para español. En una computadora se hace clic en el globito en la parte inferior de la pantalla que dice interpretación, o se usa la aplicación de Zoom en su teléfono o tableta. Haga clic en los tres puntitos, luego interpretación de idiomas, luego español y finalizado. Y no se puede acceder a la interpretación a través de un Chromebook. So if you would like to speak and participate fully in English and do not understand Spanish, please make sure to select the channel for English. If you're on a computer, click on the globe icon in the lower part of your screen that says Interpretation. Or if you're on the Zoom app on your phone or tablet, click on the three dots, then English, then Done. Interpretation is not available on Chromebook. And pedimos a las presentadoras que hablen claro y despacio, especialmente si están leyendo. We ask all presenters to speak slowly and clearly, especially if you are reading out loud. Gracias por ayudar a crear este espacio multilingüe. Thank you for helping to create this multilingual space.
And thank you so much for being here, to the interpreters and to everybody who has joined us so far. I think we can move to the next slide. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to do an introduction to DSC and what we're talking about in the webinar. We're going to do a quick overview about what are these newish since the summer federal guidance documents. We have two speakers who are going to be looking at school and district level strategies. We're going to have a Q&A. We can do that by chat and by raising hands. If you have more of like a clarifying type question that should be answered kind of by the speaker pertinent to what they're talking about at that moment, you can go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll keep an eye on it and interject if we need to, and then we will go ahead and close out. So that is the agenda for today. So we're going to start with that introduction. Next slide. So we just wanted to share what DSC's mission is, especially for those who haven't joined us before. The Dignity in Schools campaign challenges the systemic problem of push-out in our nation's schools and works to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. As a national coalition, DSC builds power amongst parents, youth, organizers, advocates, and educators to transform their own communities, support alternatives to a culture of zero tolerance, punishment, criminalization, the dismantling of public schools, and fight racism and all forms of oppression. We bring together our members through direct action organizing, public policy advocacy, and leadership development to fight for the human right of every young person to a quality education and to be treated with dignity. The goals for the presentation: we want to update you on what was released, general uses and limitations. We want to share examples about how the documents could be used in student and family advocacy. And we want to connect together, sharing strategies for coming together to address the systemic issues denying students their education. So I'm going to start off with that overview of what exactly these guidance documents are. And I'm going to slow down, I apologize. So first, I'm just going to share what is federal guidance. In general, official guidance from the federal government is a detailed explanation of how to follow new or existing laws. It does not create new laws. It does give more specific information about how laws should be interpreted and what would be considered a violation of the law. It can be rescinded or updated as administrations change. DSC members on the line will recall that the federal guidance on school discipline was released under the Obama administration, was rescinded under the Trump administration, though the civil rights laws that it pertained to were still very much in place. So, back one. So this package that was released in July of this year, they provided detailed information about how the existing laws should be interpreted in order to ensure civil rights of students are protected. Predominantly, this is related to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and relates also heavily to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So these were the actual documents that were released. Once I finish talking, I'm going to put the PowerPoint for this whole presentation in the chat, and it has live links so you can take a look. But we do want you to focus on the presentation for now. But you will have the links to everything that we're sharing, so it is available to you. I will say it is a little bit hard to find on the website. So there's like an opening letter from the secretary, what is called a Dear Colleague letter from the Office for Civil Rights, a fact sheet that is meant to be slightly more accessible, explaining the basics. And then there is the OSER's Dear Colleague letter and a Q&A similarly trying to speak in plainer language, although not always succeeding in that as well. And then there's a guide for stakeholders that's supposed to be like a general document that has some resources in it for what to do if you, want to start implementing some of the positive things that they're sharing need to be implemented. So some of the features that we wanted to flag about what's in here, although our speakers are going to go through the application part, I would say that this is certainly always been our interpretation of what these laws always said, and we are happy that it has been, more directly articulated in this guidance. So some of the items that they have said directly in here, that schools do not need to choose between complying with Section 504 and IDEA and keeping their school community, including students and staff, safe. That's almost directly a quote. We know that, but we're glad that they said it directly. There is a requirement under Section 504 to provide free and appropriate public education, and that relates to out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, threat assessments, and informal removals. Also, the non-discrimination requirements apply to school staff in the conduct of everyone within the school, including security staff and school police. They do have to provide modifications to policies, practices, and procedures when necessary to avoid discrimination. When a child's behavior impedes the learning, the IEP team must consider and include in the IEP the use of positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies to address that behavior. It acknowledges intersectional discrimination based on race and ability. And it provides a resource for schools and districts looking for positive alternatives. So as I shared, you can find the documents on the U.S. Department of Education website. This is just a little image of what it looks like. As I said, as soon as I finish talking, I'm going to share the slides in the chat that have the live links to all of it. It is kind of hard to find, so you may find that you have to keep coming back to us to find that link, because when you're just looking through the website, I personally can never find it. I have to go back to the links that I saved. So that's the way it is sometimes. So some of the ways that can be used, and our guests will talk about this more directly. The next slide is in individual cases. So families, advocates can point to pieces of the documents to make their case. Organizing, political pressure can be applied if the school, district, or state is violating students' rights in the view of the federal government. And litigation, the guidance can be used to show violations of civil rights law. And there are federal complaint processes, which we're not going to get into in this webinar, although we have had requests to cover that in a future webinar, and so I think we probably will. So the guidance articulates what the violations of the law look like, so you can file a complaint based on their own rationale. All right, so we're going to introduce the speakers now. Cheryl Poe is joining us from Advocating for Kids, which is a DSC member, and she will be looking at opportunities with individual and family advocacy. Following that, Leslie Lipson from Lipson Advocacy will be talking about strategies for collective action. And I'm going to pass it to Cheryl. Thank you so much.
Next slide, please. So hi, everyone. I will be talking about the practical uses of the guidance and actually give some real life examples of things I'm actually doing this school year, where I'm referring back to the document to get the school district to actually remove a suspension and offer supports and services. I want to start off with saying I am the executive director and founder of Advocating for Kids. We are based out of Virginia Beach, Virginia. We are in the southeastern part of Virginia, the Hampton Roads area, where a majority of my services are provided, but I also do a lot of national work as it relates to advocacy. I am a person with a disability. I have children with disabilities. My goal was never to become a special education advocate. I didn't even know what that was, but because of my own personal experiences, my life became becoming an advocate. So my perspective when I share this information, please remember I'm a parent of a child with a disability or children with disabilities, and that's my lens in addressing advocacy overall. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some of the pieces that were most exciting for me when I first read this document and the document came out. And the FAPE requirement under Section 504, I think, is crucial, important, and we need to spend a little bit of time on how you can use this information in your work with families or even dealing with community issues. If I had $1 for every Section 504 meeting that I've been in where the school personnel, the ones responsible for really understanding all of this stuff, were unaware that there's a FAPE requirement under Section 504. So that's concerning, because if you don't understand the reason, the purpose around Section 504, why it exists, then you're never really going to be able to provide the appropriate services to the student. So I think it's very important that everyone here recognizes that there is a FAPE requirement under Section 504. And that requirement is that the school is responsible to provide students with disabilities, and this is another key trigger word that they do, the regular or special education services and related aids and services that. So I just want to stop for this first part, because the key pieces I want to hear are the free and appropriate, meaning it's something that your child needs. And it is in regular education and special education and related aids. So they're saying if your child that only has a Section 504 may need to be in a special education classroom to get some additional supports, or if your child's disability that qualifies them under Section 504 requires a related service. This related aids can be interpreted as your related services. And those are things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, counseling, psychological services, training. Did I say assistive technology yet? I may have. So all of those kinds of supports are a part of the FAPE requirement under Section 504. And to me, that was exciting because that would always be a big battle in sitting at the table because staff didn't recognize that. So I was really, really glad that this definition is very clear. And I think the second piece that I want people to recognize is that in addition, so when you get you may be in regular ed, you may be in special ed, and you may need some supports, right, under your Section 504. But those supports are what design your child's individual 504 plan. And the idea of that plan and those services and those supports are to ensure that your child with the disability has the adequate opportunity to thrive, to learn, to access curriculum, to make progress on curriculum, right? Equal to that as a non-disabled individual. So in the past, I've always felt like, and I'm not an attorney, but I've always felt like this particular broad definition really in some ways, I think is better than the IDA definition. And then the second aspect of it is that, there are regulations which the guidance talks about, right? And making sure that the school district is honoring those actual requirements under Section 504. I'm going to talk about evaluations and placement a little bit more as we move through. So the key piece in this is that, guys, whenever you are working with a family or if you have a family member that has characteristics, and when I say characteristics, that could be, well, my child has just ADHD, but the characteristics that get in the way the most isn't the executive functioning, it's the noise, it's the sensory piece. So we look at that piece to identify how to get FAPE through either regular ed, special ed, or related aids or services, so that though your child is having that response due to the disability, they're still accessing FAPE. And that's true for any behaviors that are associated with your child's impairment, any diagnosis that you have outside of the school district that are getting in the way of learning, that cause your child not to be able to access the curriculum, make progress in the curriculum, equal or adequately to a student that doesn't have a disability of some sort. Next slide. The valuations. This to me too is exciting. I feel like I'm a guidance nerd because I did get so excited about the various information that was in there and some of the clarification language that was there. Again, at the table, guys, if you have a student here, I highlighted the must. When you see must or shall in either regulatory language or in guidance, that means that there's an obligation, there's a responsibility of the school personnel to do something. They are responsible for doing a prompt evaluation for a student and no cost to the parent. They should not be sending you back to your pediatrician or the child's private neurodevelopmental person that they're working with. The school district has a responsibility at no cost to the parent or guardian, right? When, again, the key word is the school folks have a reason to believe a student needs special education or related services, and that they may have a disability. That is the school's duty. That is also something referred to oftentimes as child find, right? The school must evaluate. They need to identify children in school whose, due to behaviors or due to their disabilities or the way that they learn or their neural functioning, need more support. So the school has an obligation. So this guidance is, you could use it. You have a child that you know has a disability. You're working with a family that has a child with dyslexia, and the school district's like, well, we don't really believe that reading, your child reading one deviation standard below norm requires or is elevated to an IEP, but it might elevate to a Section 504. And if they don't evaluate you for IDEA, make sure you're getting those evaluations under Section 504. And when the school fails to do that, when they know your child's failing and they're not doing this, I would file a claim against them because they have the obligation. They're the experts. So that's number one. Number two, and again, it goes back to that school must conduct the initial evaluation at no cost. And this is an interesting part where it says, regardless of whether a parent or guardian has requested that evaluation. Again, the guidance puts more emphasis on the responsibilities and regulatory obligations of the school district. And when they don't do that, when they don't meet that obligation and your child is suspended, made a recommendation for expulsion, you're being called to come pick your child up from school because they're saying their behavior is such that they can't say, then the school's failed your child if they haven't evaluated. If the school is using time, energy, money to tell you what to do for your child, and that they're not honoring any of the language that is more clearly articulated in this guidance. Next. Number 5, if the student is doing well academically, that does not justify saying, we're not going to evaluate your child. That, school districts love to hide behind, they passed their standard test in Virginia, it's an SOL test, right? Oh, they passed their standardized test, they're getting A's and B's. But the kid's being suspended still because of other behavioral things, right? Other things affiliated with their disability. So just because that child is progressing, that child has good grades, if the child is still missing crucial instruction because they're being removed from a classroom or they're being removed from the educational setting, then that's still missed instruction for that child. That means that the child could do even better academically if they were in school more, and they would be in school more if the team had evaluated to assess what the child needed to address the behaviors that are causing the phone calls or the suspensions or the in-school, out-of-school suspensions, referral for long-term suspensions. So that's really important. And then the next one, the student's evaluation shows that challenging behaviors is based on the disability, right? The team of knowledgeable individuals are responsible for determining the kinds of services and supports the schools must provide to address the behaviors. So it is not okay for the team to say, okay, we've identified that your child has a disability, and we are just going to offer 3 or 4 accommodations, such as preferential seating or extended time to complete a task, or has a hall pass for water when requested. That is not digging deep enough to address the behaviors. That is not going to change behavior at all. That's not going to do anything. So challenge the teams to develop supports and services equivalent to that if the child was getting services under IDEA. They have access to those same kinds of resources. You can still do a functional behavioral assessment under a Section 504. You can still develop a BIP, sorry, I use initials in people, and I forgot not everybody knows them. I'll start with the functional behavioral assessment. That is something that you would still have access to under a Section 504. And that is to look at, collect data, engage the student if it's appropriate, to identify some of the triggers, identify what is underneath the behaviors, if you can, and then use that to develop a behavioral intervention plan. You identify when we call on the student that they act out, throw stuff, rip up paper. And this is a really simple example. Well, guess what? Stop calling on the student without preparation, or don't call on them at all and figure out an alternative way that can be put in the plan for the child to get their participation points in class without triggering a response that leads to a behavior that could remove the student from the school or the classroom in the educational setting. And again, not just a psychological evaluation, number 5. It needs to be a whole bunch of different resources. If a lot of children have comorbidities, meaning you don't just have ADHD or you don't just have autism. You may have autism and ADHD. You may have ADHD and dyslexia. You may have dysgraphia and dyslexia. So you want to make sure you're still evaluating the whole child. So you want to pull from a lot of resources to evaluate. And one of the things about the clarification in the guidance that I thought was important and almost kind of missed, and I hope this helps others, is that, usually under IDEA, at least in our state, they make you wait until you're eligible under IDEA before they start to evaluate for related services. There's no requirement like that under Section 504. So at the same time, they're doing your typical neuropsych evaluations or your psychological evaluations, your education evaluations, that you can, as a parent, request that you also do the speech, the OT, the physical therapy, the assistive technology, whatever hearing, auditory processing kinds of testing, do them all together and take all of that information together and develop a 504. Now, I've been doing that a lot this year, and one of the things that I've noticed in 2 of my cases, once I get in the meeting and I start asking for all of these evaluations to be done under Section 504 and they get done, the team immediately recognizes that the student needs more than the Section 504. The student needs an IEP, because the 504, there's, school personnel don't get that extra funding for it. So they like to put kids in IDEA instead. But my recommendation is try this first to see if that can work for your child. If doing a nice comprehensive Section 504 plan may work for your child, because to be honestly, Black children with disabilities have not fared well under IDEA and IEPs. Maybe this language, maybe us reframing how we look at getting our kids services, maybe this is a way to deal with some of those disparities that do exist. Next slide, please. Okay, this is stopping suspensions. And I've had, again, about 3 cases, and I'm working on one now, where I've been able to use information in the guidance to stop a suspension. So next slide, I'm going to kind of go through what they have. Now, this is an example that's actually put in the fact sheet that you can read. And they talk about a disability-based behavior that could trigger an evaluation. And this is an example of a student who had not been identified yet, repeatedly referred to discipline following inappropriate verbal outbursts beyond the expected age, of similar students, and may need an evaluation when the student, to make sure that the student is receiving FAPE. So this is the example they give. I'm gonna make this a kid. This is actually a student that I had to share. So I had an ADHD guy, right? And he was, the parent, he wasn't receiving anything. He was in 10th grade. The parent herself had been trying her hardest to have the student qualified for services, because he privately was getting therapy. He had a diagnosis, he was taking medication, but the school kept denying the evaluation under IDEA. The kid engaged in the behavior because, I don't know, he thought it would be cool and brought some alcohol to school. He brought like a bottle that had vodka and gin mixed in it. He hadn't drinking any of it, but he was going in class, like trying to be cool, asking his peers, hey, I got some alcohol, you want to try it? Of course, somebody narked on him, he got told on. So they wanted to make an expulsion. They wanted to expel the kid from school, but put him in an alternative school setting. We were able to stop that on 2 levels. We were like, hey, first of all, there's tons of documentation from your staff that this kid needed help and was struggling, but the parent is asked over and over and over again for evaluations. We were able to immediately use this document and go back. If you go back to some of this, if you go back to the slides, the first one about Section 504, I was able to, Ruth, can you go back on this slide? Keep next one. This one here. Oh, wait. We were there, the first slide, next one. This, right? So I was able to use both of these pieces out of our document to say, hey, you all never evaluated this kid. You had knowledge the kid was struggling. You yourselves documented that the kid was struggling. He's been suspended before. The mother provided you with proof that he had ADHD. You did nothing, right? So I was able to stop the suspension and expulsion. We got the kid evaluated under Section 504, and I loaded it up. I mean, they evaluated for everything, and we were literally able to get him. We stopped the expulsion, got him a 504 plan in place, and then because there was so much information from the evaluations, the team allowed him to have a Section 504, come back to school, and then use a lot of that information for him to be identified as a student under IDEA, which gave him even more protection. But it was like, it was just perfect. It like just kind of fit this language. The case fit this language to a T, you know? So I'll kind of, so we can go back to the other example. Okay, good. So that's an example of real, that's what the language says, but that's a real life example of how to use that and how to use the information from the documents. So it's very important, I think, you know, invoke protections under 504 for issues. If your child's being suspended, if your child's not making progress, if your child's struggling and the school's sending you information about, you know, what your child's doing, that is proof that they are not meeting the obligations and the requirements that are documented in the guidance and in the fact letters. And then also make sure when you do request your evaluations, they are not don't let them limit it to just a psychological evaluation. Our children are so much more complex than just our IQs. We need to be looking at education evaluations. We need to be looking at OT to see if writing is an issue, because we need to look at speech and language. There may be other supports with counseling that could be helpful. So you really want to look at the whole child, even under your Section 504, if we want to stop some of these ridiculous and unnecessary suspensions and exclusionary practices that we're seeing in our schools. And it also, again, kind of like talks about, I just want to bring up the restraint and seclusion, because I'm a big restraint and seclusion, anti-restraint and seclusion. Guidance does also talk about that. If you are restraining a child, if a child is being held down, their body's being restricted by adults, right? And you're holding that child down until you see fit, or you're taking a child against their will and putting them in a cell, because that's what a lot of the seclusion rooms are, cells. But you're not identifying that this child may have a disability, that's an issue, okay? So this is some just really good stuff to help your community start recognizing and protecting our children from some of these practices. Next slide. And thank you, I'm done. Leslie's up. I know she's gonna do a great job. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I just put in the chat that we have a link to a longer presentation that Cheryl has done on the topic of the guidance. So if you want to hear more from her, the link to the video is in the chat. And yes, we'll pass it to Leslie. Thank you for joining us, Leslie.
That was so great. And I just want to tell y'all that I'm going to need a little more interaction. I understand this is a webinar, and I understand that you probably have a lot going on, but I'm first going to need you to drop in the chat, if you can, any particular burning issues you have around working collectively in a group around these types of issues. What are your biggest barriers? Why is it challenging to get a cohesive idea with other folks about how to advocate for something and what you're advocating for? Because that's what we're going to be talking about. So my name is Leslie Lipson. I'm an attorney in Georgia, and I've worked on several really kind of big collective advocacy campaigns. Let's turn to the next slide. And so I just wanted to say a guiding force for my work and what I would encourage you to think about when you are going big picture. So the link from Cheryl's presentation to this is, so you have guidance either on this or other types of guidance, or you have OCR letters, or you have other kinds of material you want to use to create momentum and to continue engaging stakeholders. What are some lessons I've learned the past 20 years? And I could only tell you that I've only learned them through making every mistake in the book. So please do not let me sit up here with some sort of halo or, trophy, because it's just kind of been hard fought. And we're really talking about policies. So instead of thinking about, can my child participate? What supports make up my child's participation possible? So if you're thinking about this from a collective action arena. We're thinking about what are the policies either from our state or from our district or from the federal government that create the biggest barriers to kids participating. And what is the biggest bang for our buck? And I don't mean just financially, I also mean emotional labor and our limited advocacy energy. What is the biggest pieces of energy we can put into making the supports possible so that children can have an equal opportunity and get the really good things that schools have to offer. Next slide. And so, as Cheryl laid out for y'all, some of the unique opportunities present for collective action within this process, this 504 discipline process. So if you can see from this flow chart, and I'm definitely not going through this with y'all because that's a whole nother training, which I do enjoy. But typically, if you were looking for bigger places for collective action, you would look at it kind of where one arrow meets another area. I would always encourage people to swim upstream to look for the places that we want to put our leverage. Obviously, when horrible things happen to kids, when they are criminalized because of their behavior, when kids are excluded and kicked out, and we want to ask the question, what can we do to make children whole again? That's legal language. I don't think kids are made whole again. Like trauma is not a zero-sum game, right? I wish I could see your faces. I hope that you are, nodding and agreeing. So we really want to look earlier in the process to see where we can have collective action. Next. And so let's be really clear about this, what this is. We can put a lot of safety protections and a lot of safeguards in it, but this system is functioning exactly how it should. It's a highly segregated system where we have kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities. And we're trying to put some sort of evaluation where we stick the kids in the disability category, but they're not in the disability category. And now in the categories, the 504 IDEA, it's very confusing. And it really puts parents and advocates and people with disabilities at a major disadvantage. And I know as civil rights advocates, we will all agree that putting the burden of every bit of the advocacy on the shoulders of all the people that are they're very oppressed by ableism and racism and homophobia and classism and all these pieces is really what's the word for it? It's a travesty. And here we are still trying to, put our finger in the dikes, right? Next. And so I really want to talk about different ways to frame advocacy issues. I know this is kind of like maybe something you're like, oh my gosh, Leslie or Lipson, most people end up calling me. And maybe you're thinking, what is this about? But I just want to tell you that framing is everything. And Dignity in Schools has always been a really excellent role model for this in our field. So framing isn't just how you talk about it and not just the language you use, but it's also creating a cohesive narrative that other folks can get around. And so I want to talk about some work I've been doing for a long time. In Georgia, we have a segregated school system called the GNETs. They call it, the state calls it the Georgia Network for Educational and Therapeutic Supports. You can see my fingers, I just did jazz fingers. It is neither educational nor therapeutic. And I try not to ever call it that. And so I actually got the opportunity, by the way, when you get a good narrative, you get a much better opportunity to work with media. So I worked with a writer at The New Yorker for a period of time. And the narrative we came up with was this idea, which is true, but there was an entire segregated school system in Georgia, and people didn't know about it. And part of the reason, I didn't want people to be like, the narrative wasn't to be, how do you not know about this? Aren't you a good taxpayer, a good advocate, or a good whatever? It was more like, of course you don't know about it. The state kept it a secret. Now that you know about it, what are you going to do? And so, I worked on that narrative for a long time, and then the New Yorker picked it up, and that was exciting. Next. One of my best tricks, and I'm sure y'all use it too, but it's really good to know about, is you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. I have never won arguments about the kid did this, the kid didn't do this, the kid did this, I saw this. Once you start arguing discipline, you are, how do I say this? You are at a major disadvantage. I always talk about how the school is the actor. I sit down with families and parents and policymakers and go back through with the school. So they'd say, well, what happened? I'll give you an example. And they'd say, well, this young person got in a fight and they hit this person and then this thing happened and now we have manifestation. No. Let's go back and reframe that. The school wasn't supervising the young person. There are indicators within the IUP or 504 plan that the very behaviors that made it likely fertile ground for this kid to get in a fight occurred that were already within the IEP team or 504 minutes and notes. The school let that happen, and therefore the student was failed by the lack of services of the school, and this happened. And hopefully you can see that subtle shift, as in the kid made the decisions, as in the school failed their obligation. And so part of framing is so important. You can use this framing in school-based meetings. You can use this framing in whole school discussions. And good, I'm glad we love reframing. Reframing is so important. And I have to tell you, you really need other advocates. It's hard. We've learned like this language around schools for many, many years, so we need to reframe it. Next. So I love this type of framing. I use this framing a lot in discipline cases and individual litigation. So math, we teach, we practice, we reinforce, we repeat. Reading, we teach it, we practice, we reinforce, we repeat. You get where I'm going here. Writing, same ideas. Behavior, punish, 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 punish. So back to making the school the actor. Schools want to make sure, put it down as kids are the actor. I usually go through the school. What's the school's replacement behavior for the behavior they've been using for punishing kids by loss of instruction? For example, we never call it in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. It's punishing kids by loss of instruction. One of the first due process hearings I ever won on discipline was counting the minutes of punishment by loss of instruction. So opposing counsel came with, this huge stack of behavior logs and all the behavior incidences of the kid. And we came back with just minutes of instruction missing over and over and over again. And so we have to continue this reframing. It's very powerful, whether you're on an individual child's advocacy, you're looking at a bigger picture. Next. Schools are starting to understand that this kind of really narrow FBABP stuff that we have to use as advocates, Cheryl went through it. It's pretty, how do we say it? It's pretty narrow. I don't think a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists are really behind it. It's very, very, very rudimentary. And I think you and I could both agree, if we thought about our worst behaviors, and I have a lot of them, that it's unlikely that they fall under these first kind of 4 ideas. That people have a lot more reasons that folks' behavior might not exactly mesh with or quantify what schools are expecting right now. Beyond schools, very subjective, oftentimes oppressive behavioral control regimes, there are a lot of other reasons. And I think that these kinds of reasons are other ways of framing when we bring forth information. So one example is when I've had kids who are classified as emotional behavior disturbed because they have a unusual reaction to a set of behaviors. That's one of the classifications. I'll say to somebody, this is a trigger warning, by the way, for abuse. But the idea being, if a kid was massively abused before the age of 3, who are you to say that the way that they're reacting right now is maladaptive? That it isn't the way you'd expect them to react? I'd argue it's exactly how you'd react. If you had food insecurity, yes, you'd take a lot of food. You'd take everybody's food. You would go for the food. I would go for the food. That's not maladaptive, that's adaptive. And so I think we have to continue switching these things on people's heads and tell them the truth. Truth is free. Well, retaliation is not free, but from a budget perspective. Okay, next. So Another piece we've been working on, which is really challenging, I think because of, in part, the real silos in the field of educational advocacy, right? You have experts in advocating on behalf of kids with disabilities. You have experts in kids who are experiencing homophobia and transphobia. You have experts for kids who maybe weren't born in this country and have a huge uphill battle to fight. You have experts in poverty law or experts in, I'm missing some areas, this is not exhaustive. But not only are these lawyers or advocates experts in these different areas, the money that comes along to fund this work is also siloed. So we're working really hard to hold the intersectional identity of the kids and oftentimes the families and the advocates, us, our own identities, what we bring forth to the table as we're doing this work next. And so you're likely familiar with of blessed memory, Audre Lorde. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I've never had a case brought to me or an issue brought to me that was only about ableism or only about white supremacy or only about people's deeply held beliefs about who and a group they're not really familiar with are. Next. So Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar, came up with the idea of intersectionality and thinking about how these identities intersect and how societal privilege and oppression is intensified by multiple identities. Next. And I'm not going to read this to you. You can take a look at it, but I always want to include a couple more slides and we can get to. Next. And so when we're thinking about the intersectional identities of who's involved, I want to talk about a couple other pieces within our collective advocacy work, our grassroots work, our kind of groundswell work, some things that sometimes trip us up that make it a lot more difficult for our work to be successful. So other idea I want to put forth, not an idea, but for instance, with the intersectionality, even if you can't provide support for every part of somebody's identity, then making it much more likely they're getting the short end of the stick in school, you at least would acknowledge it. So at least acknowledge the wounds that people have experienced at the hands of the system, whether it's your kind of area of expertise or not. Number two, we operate a lot of advocacy spaces that can be pretty hostile to people. So let's think about, we call it radical hospitality. Look at universal design for learning, making sure that you're, when you're teaching people skills or figuring out what's going on in the room or doing listening sessions, that the material is accessible, you're not using a lot of jargon, you're doing it in short bites. Let's look about having accessibility into these processes, be incorporating the design of them. Everything we do is accessible. It should be really accessible. We should be role modeling for the school how to be inclusive and accessible. How are we holding them accountable when we don't do the same? We got to do this, right? Additionally, we have to really make it easy for folks. So, you know, obviously Thursday nights and Sunday mornings and using Zoom and continuing to make sure that we are meeting people where they are and we're listening to the community. And like, if you can get people coffee and a sandwich, like folks need sustenance. And we need a variety of people to plug in things a variety of ways. And so let's not create that barrier. Next. Do not become the problem you set out to solve. So we're all at risk for this, especially with our unconscious. I'm going to give you some quick examples next. So ableism, and this is by far my favorite definition, is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence. These ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, and capitalism. It's systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining who's valuable and worthy. You don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. And ableism is a constant theme throughout special education and special education advocacy. So we have to be really aware of that and work within our unconscious to understand like what policies and practices are ableist and to speak about them as such. Next. This is an excellent example of not becoming the problem we set out to solve. I think the American Psychiatric Association would say that they, weren't planning on causing people great harm through supporting structural racism, but they did, and they came and apologized. But we can all become the harm we set out to solve. Next, another example. School suspension data shows glaring disparities in discipline by race. We call it disparities, they call it disproportionality. I don't know, I usually just try to call it racism. I think a lot of the sanitizing of the language is the problem, and we have to work on that. And then the American Medical Association, you think that unconsciously they would have recognized racism as a public health threat long before, I think this was this year. So there's a lot of unconscious harm happening. And of course, the impact to people doesn't matter whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's the same, right? Next. And so we have to sit down by ourselves or with other people. We have to the next point, pay people for their labor and continue learning about what we both hold consciously and unconsciously, assumptions about the special education arena. And so when I say value folks' time, I mean, when I work with organizing groups, you start on time, you end on time, calls to action, many different roles for people to do, and offering people appropriate supports. Have you ever been a volunteer on a volunteer project and you come and like, you feel like you really didn't do anything, or you weren't really helpful, or people didn't really need you? I have, and I didn't come back. So part of this is to make sure that people have roles within the advocacy work that not only seem important, but are. And people can smell kind of BS, like, just thank you for filling the seat. They don't want that. People really do want, they don't want fake book advocacy. They don't want to sign a petition. Maybe they'll sign a petition. But people really do want to be deeply involved. Next. Back one more. I think we missed one little thing at the bottom. Seek, listen, and value people that are impacted by the particular issue in question. So next. The idea being, if we're coming from an intersectionality place, it's unlikely that the volunteers or the paid staff in that particular issue would have lived experience in all of those intersectional identities. It's a lot less likely. And so we all have to think about these terms. I don't know. I need to learn more. That's best addressed from the community in question, or at least informed. Lots of listening, lots of deep relationships. I'm not sure yet. What do you think about it? And let me tell you, in law school, they can teach me to say a lot of these things. You have to relearn those ideas of being comfortable to say you just don't know. And you have to avoid people, avoid advocates, intellectuals, people who don't say these things. They are not our people. We are like deeply curious, lifelong learners. And that's the only way we're going to stay true. Next. So if you value educational equity work, value it by putting financial resources towards it. So this is what I mean. Because when you're working with folks in a community and they're doing lots of driving for you, make sure in your grant or in your positions you put in gas money. Feed people, pay people. When I have folks now, I did not always, folks with disabilities or parents of kids with disabilities who come and present in any of the things I do, if I don't have money in my budgets to pay them for their time and their story, I don't ask them. It's part of equity in the work. And so I think we have to be really careful about putting our financial resources towards supporting people in a variety of ways, including childcare, accessibility, all these pieces. And there are a lot of ways to do that. And then I'd also talk about unlikely allies, ask with abandon. And one of the stories is I was the director of this initiative called the Safe Schools Initiative, where we we prohibited the use of seclusion in the state of Georgia and greatly limited the use of restraint. And one of our most unlikely allies was HR of very big school districts, the people who do risk, oh my gosh, it's not a risk assessment, it is, for teachers that were injured on the job. And I'm sure you will not be surprised, but many teachers are injured through the use of restraint and seclusion. And by reducing the use of restraint and seclusion, it really helped out districts' bottom line. And I had no idea that would be a very strong ally in our restraint and seclusion work would be insurance companies in places that do workman's comp for school districts. So I always say a lot of the issues we're doing are issues people care about, or people don't know yet that they should care about them. So do not be afraid to get told no a lot. Next. Create, hone, and focus on shared visions. So this is really hard in the world of advocacy. And let me tell you, we all rush so fast to get that advocacy done. We are rushing for it, and we don't take the time to set a very strong collective vision. So this is from the Safe Schools Initiative, the work we did against the use of restraint and seclusion. And this took a long time, but the vision was to shift the culture of Georgia public schools so that all students have the right to receive an appropriate education, an environment that fosters learning and encourages the use of positive behavior supports. All students shall be free from restraint and seclusion in Georgia schools. Going back to framing, notice how we did it all students. In Georgia, we decided, after many conversations, that we weren't going to limit the use of restraint and seclusion to kids with disabilities, because we know who's going to get restrained and secluded. It's going to get, in Georgia, much like the nation, it is Black boys and men on the way to the special education school to prison pipeline. So we knew that. So we knew it had to be all students, because otherwise people would try to get around it. And think about the other pieces kind of the framing about the environment. And it's about what public schools are doing. And so that's our framing. This is our vision. And we continually go back to the vision. Next. In another group that I'm currently the director of, the Georgia Coalition for Equity in Education, it's a very loose kind of alliance by groups with expertise in education, mental health, child welfare, juvenile justice, and developmental disabilities. Also civil rights, parents, self-advocacy, youth groups. This is our goal. Provide strategy impacting a settlement and negotiations with the Department of Justice with our state and our stakeholders, resulting in the rights of students to have meaningful supports in a most integrated setting. So the other thing with mission and vision is you don't also want it too big. Helping every student in every way, it's unlikely. So I think part of what people are looking for when you're recruiting volunteers and you're working with stakeholders is they're looking for something that has tight enough lines that they know what you're asking for and you know what you're asking for. Next. Another example is this. I will own this, but a lot of us advocates out here, we're real good at spotting all the problems. We have a lot harder time sometimes in explaining our vision of what's possible. So years ago in this work against our statewide segregated school system, which is called, again, the GNUTS, we came up with this idea of what we want to happen. So students will be served in their neighborhood schools. Students will be served in general education classrooms by having equal access to educational opportunities. And we continually look to these three things as remedy-focused advocacy. So are there people within this loose coalition that may be advocating for other things besides these three things? For sure. But when people are confused about what exactly to say and how to go do it, you want clear and concise talking points, and you want to create them in a democratic process. Next. So this is an example of a letter that we wrote maybe 5 or 6, 7 years ago after the Georgia Coalition for Equity in Education. We had the Department of Justice write a letter finding about what's happening in our segregated schools. And I don't know if you know this, but I did not know this, but just because the Department of Justice does a letter of finding, that doesn't mean they're actually going to litigate it. So we had to put a lot of pressure as this group to get the DOJ to actually file the thing. So I wanted to see an example of some of the written communication that we used in this. So we always explain like what it is. We always show people what it is. We always kind of I love the idea of keeping the momentum, but we still need you. So even this idea, this is an incredible first step. There's still much to be done. Okay, next slide. So we got the Department of Justice. They were coming to do investigations. So we worked with them to make sure that we were having multiple meetings in Georgia. You can see how many different meetings we had all across Georgia and different times, right? So we're making it accessible for people. We're making it places they know where it is. By the way, this is like 10 years ago. This is like pre-Zoom. And we are giving the information about the feds, it's us. We also prepped, which you can't see, is we prepped families to tell their stories, right? Back to the framing and narrative. Families need assistance on how to tell the story. And I'm not saying that families don't know what to say. They totally know what to say. It's just they know everything. So you just kind of help people kind of pick out the things that might engage DOJ more than other facts. If that makes sense. Next. And then notice we say, come meet with the DOJ and tell them the stories. And then this next part, another way to be involved is for families or students to speak with media. Call us if you're interested in that. Then another ask, please forward this email to other individuals. Another ask. So another piece is to give people multiple ways that they can plug in and feel like they did something good. Not feel like, that they did something good and they did something helpful. And people did, by the way. This litigation got filed after DOJ came back to Georgia again, because as you know, the Department of Justice doesn't live in Georgia. They're going to have a hard time getting family stories. The only way to get family stories is to meet with families. The only way for that to happen is for advocates on the ground to find families, help them feel safe and supported and be safe and supported, help them tell their story and get it together. Next. So I wanted to give you a couple quick examples of some of the coalition and loose kind of community building and different work we've been doing in Georgia. I know y'all have examples all over your states. And I wanted to end with this particular poem, which I really like. So there's no power greater than community discovering what it cares about. Ask what's possible, not what's wrong. Keep asking, notice what you care about. Assume that many others share your dreams. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to people you know and talk to people you don't know. Talk to people you never, ever talk to. Be intrigued by the differences that you hear. Expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone's an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change the world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together, Margaret Wheatley. And the last piece I would tell you, in a lot of the advocacy efforts that we've had around collective action, and I do think that this particular guidance does have some interesting opportunities. They're not always immediately successful. I think a lot of this work is conscious raising, and it takes quite some time. So I just think you have to remember that time is on your side. So thank you very much. And I know that we're going to have Q&A now.
Yes, thank you so much, Leslie and Cheryl, for sharing your presentation. So we do have about as much time as we wanted to have for the Q&A, which is about 25 minutes. So that's great. And we hope that people are able to share different questions based on the presentation and also the guidance, if you have been able to take a look at it or you have been using it. One strange thing that has happened is that a lot of people are in this webinar under the same name. There may be a problem if you raise your hand and you have been named Jessica against your will. I will try to figure it out. There may be a little bit of a problem there. So if you are for some reason named Jessica in this webinar, that might make more sense for you to put a question in the chat. And I see, yes, people, if you can change your own name, if you notice that, I think if you just click on the two little dots next to your name, it'll give you the option to rename. Funny, strange Zoom happening. There's always something. And so, yes. So we can start sharing questions in the chat. I haven't seen any yet, but I did want to flag that Kem shared earlier in response to your question, Leslie, about from the very beginning, like what are things that make it hard? Kem shared how not to be outnumbered at these meetings. Parents need better support in these gatherings as much as possible. So I don't know if either of you wants to respond to that in particular as an issue, as other people think of your questions, and put them in the chat or raise your hand.
What was the question again? I'm sorry, I missed
It's
it.
not really a question. I would say it's more of a theme. So in the beginning,
Okay.
Leslie had shared a question for the group, which was like, what are the things that are difficult, or and one of the things that Kem shared in the chat was that it's hard to not be outnumbered in these meetings, and that people need support. So
and that's a strategy, believe it or not. I mean, I've learned and been doing this for over 20 years, right? So that I see that being a strategy. You know, parents go into a meeting and they have 15 people there. Parents bring an advocate, now they got 25 people there. Right. And it's me and that parent sometimes alone. So my recommendations are never go to an IEP meeting alone if you can help that. And you can bring a family member. You can bring somebody from your church. You could even within your own little community, like set up systems where there's 3 or 4 of you that are all having maybe some similar issues. Your kids all go to the same school and you work as a unit where you're sharing each other resources with each other's, and you attend each other's IEP meeting. The school district ultimately has the authority to invite who they want to invite. But you too can. You can also, you have that same right to say, I need more support because I feel outnumbered and I feel overwhelmed. But I think it's a tactic to kind of put parents on their heels.
Now, I want to add that is also a policy, you know, like we can advocate to our school districts that we want a policy that actually does just that, making sure that parents are not outnumbered at those meetings, and that you can match the staff. You know, we got 10, you got 10. You know what I mean? Like it could really be some policy work around that on the local level.
Thanks, Kem. Are there other questions? I see Miss Ellen. I'm unmuting you. Can you hear us? Miss Ellen? Oh, there you go.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to add to the speaker before and thank Dr. Poe for bringing more people with you, but this is what happens when you do that. Everybody then is required to sign this form around confidentiality issues. Same thing when you go into a discipline hearing. Oftentimes the attorney is there, you show up, then there's all this paperwork on your child that the parent doesn't have, that nobody has. When you walk out the room with that paperwork, then you got a charge for taking the district's material. So both to Leslie, I think, and Dr. Poe, this notion of trying to work collectively and with school districts becomes very challenging for parents, particularly I think for Black parents and parents of color. When we go in this room, there's already a sense of hostility. You know, when we work with advocates, particularly white women, they want us to go in a certain way. They don't want us to be pissed off. But by the time we get to that point, pardon my language, we pissed off. We don't have time to be nice. We going up in there because you have denied our children services and we see our children suffering. So, you know, we've got to get beyond that, and school districts taking it personal when we advocate for children, and somehow parents are entering, or advocates are entering that space with hostility. We got to be prepared when we go up in there, because that's what we're meeting. So I just wanted to raise that up and thank that person, because that's a policy we need. But man, that policy then becomes so cumbersome for all of us. Thank you.
Can I follow up? Matt,
Yeah.
you are absolutely right. And you hit something that I wanted to that I think is important that we talk about, which is those microaggressions. And we have to call them out in the meetings. And I myself hadn't been doing that, and started doing that more so at the IEP table when I'm witnessing that, right? I'm stopping it. I'm saying, you are not allowed to discount, right, this parent's emotional attachment to the way that her child's been treated. And start throwing at and start using like framing, I guess, right, Leslie? I never thought of it that way, like reframing that kind of projection of just you're an angry Black woman. I mean, it's like, no, I have a right to be annoyed. You've hurt my child. You're continuing to hurt my child. And that does hurt. And I am doing my best to express it. So I ask my parents that I work with, guess what? You're okay. It's okay to be angry. No, do not bring cupcakes to the IEP meeting to kind of bribe them to do their job. They're paid to do that job. And that's an old school white supremacist view on advocacy. And unfortunately, that's all we really had in our leadership about learning special education advocacy, right? We got Pete Wright. He's white, but he's a white supremacist. He doesn't get it. We have COPA. I was on the board with COPA, 23 white rich folks making money through litigating cases in Black communities and then getting that money from the school districts, but not doing anything within their structure, right, to create space for those people they're making money off, Black people like me. So I got really passionate about what you said, because everything that you just said is that the system has been developed in advocacy to meet the needs of white affluent women and not Black folk, and we need to take that back. So good points, thank you. I'm feeling hopeful in knowing other people in the community are starting to recognize that and speak that out loud.
And I think that's one place where I put in where you can call some nice white ladies in and make us corral our own and take responsibility, and to say to people, no, you can't talk to people that way, and to see if you can let these things be called out. Additionally, I think we have to take a really, a very critical look at our advocacy materials. And I think that have really, they have codified the culture of white supremacy to be the appropriate advocacy actions. Okay, y'all, we can talk more about that. Other people can talk about that.
I believe that's a whole conversation that we need to have separately. I really do. In this, not maybe here, but there needs to be that space in the advocacy world having those conversations, because otherwise, if we don't, it's going to be the same thing. If we don't start speaking up against it.
It's another way also blaming the victim. It's one of the reasons, like none of my presentations talk about communication skills. If you just asked really nicely in a really nice way, the school is just going to give your kids great services. You just haven't asked nicely enough. I'm, never going to do that. And I think that a lot of our advocacy materials really do assume that it is a woman who belongs, to the power structure of that community who just can't quite get enough OT hours for her kid. And we're not, maybe one day, they'll hit disproportionately enough on their head and everybody's getting screwed by the discipline system, not just Black kids and kids of color. But right now, that's not where we are.
Miss Betty, I see your hand is raised. I'm gonna take you off mute. You should be off now. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I think one of the things that was actually shown in the presentation is knowing your rights. That to me is one of the things that we definitely go over with parents, of having parents to understand what their rights are, because so many times when parents come in just like me with my voice that I have, oh, you know, I'm being so disrespectful and all, but this is my voice and this is the way that I talk. And my thing of it is of just like I tell parents and I let the administrators of the school know as well, you're not going to talk to the parent or even to the student the way in which you think you want to talk with them. You're going to talk with them with respect, because if parents come in and raising their voice and all, they want to say, oh, now I understand where the child gets it from because the parents acts like this. No, your purpose there is to provide the services for the child. And if that services is not being provided, then we have a due right to even file charges and all. But you know, they want us to come in like we are bowing down to them to say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and all. No, we have a different approach, because you should be raising, you should be teaching our children. And as Ellen said before, of course, I know exactly who it is because we were in there together. But sometimes you have to depart because they want to say that Black women are so aggressive and all. But to me, we say what we mean and we mean what we say. You cannot talk or do our children any kind of way that you think that you want to do. And then about the ideal of, you know, well, if you come in talking right to them, no, the thing of it is, it's okay. And I tell my parents, it's okay for you to be angry. It's okay for you to be angry, because they should be teaching our children the way in which they are supposed to. But also in the meantime, too, we have to understand that we have some administrators, teachers and all, that do not know that education law. So they feel as though that they can say and do what they want to do because they do not know the law.
Thanks so much. I was remembering, unrelated to the guidance, but to our work around ESSA, the, again, newish, not so new anymore, education law. We got, you know, we had our federal liaisons who were trained on every aspect of the law, and 9 times out of 10, they knew more than any other person at the schools that they were that they were
Yeah.
working in, because what so sometimes especially this federal level stuff, you may be alerting people to the existence of this guidance, and again, like I said, it's not even that easy to find on the website, so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this webinar, to make sure that people were even aware of it. Are there other questions? And you can type it in the chat or raise your hand. Or comments about something that was, you know, most impactful for you. I saw a few, you know, comments about how this was a great session. Kim, go ahead. I think you should be able to, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Oh, I was gonna ask whether or not, do you think we could develop a good fact sheet from this? Or like go back to whatever questions were asked and put them all together as a report out, you know, to the membership?
I think definitely, so we can share the slides, and we're going to have a edited YouTube video that has some parts of the beginning taken out when we were still figuring out the tech. So we can definitely share that. I think, yes, I mean, I think we can put together some type of summary. We were having conversations about that a while ago, and that kind of grew into us having this whole webinar. But I think somebody else shared recently too that handouts are really helpful to have. So maybe we can. It sounds like there's. For me, there are like two sections of this webinar that seem to be that people are having reactions to, and the content of it, you know, like the summary part about what is in this guidance, but maybe also some of a separate document that has some of the conversation more around like framing in general and advocacy and the challenges that people have shared.
But I mean, even like the strategies for a parent, like we could really develop some type of, you know, handout card or bookmark or something that just has these simple strategies that we could use, you know, across all of our advocacy.
I like that idea.
And one thing that I wasn't charged with presenting, but I just want to take the framing thing to the individual student. Creating narratives about students and pushing forward with the true narrative of student is, parents can do that long before there is a disciplinary issue. But people will make up their mind in the story of who kids are. And I'll never forget a particular story I had where there was a young man who had very poor, like global functioning scores. He was in all classes for kids who had like slow cognition and lots of things. And he got in a fight. He was like 16. And I just met this family and I met him and I was like, yeah, I read these records of your kid. What's your kid like? And she's like, my kid takes care of his 4 younger siblings every single day after school. He actually owned a lawnmower business. He actually owned 3 lawnmowers in the community and was a business owner. School didn't know that, by the way. And he had a really viable business. And so when you talk about packing the room, you're so right. We had the pastor come. We had 2 of his current clients come. We had an aunt come who he took care of the neighborhood kids. This is right before the manifestation. And around the framing pieces, tried to, and by the way, I understand the audience is hostile, but tried to reframe this kid as an entrepreneur who's a caregiver who had a moment, like many kids in school, versus a kid, quickly on his way to jail. And so I do think some of these framing pieces, they matter in the big picture, but they also matter in creating the framing narrative of kids, which I think is much harder for families who are Black and kids of color, because the deck is stacked.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments in the chat or hands raised. So one last call before we start wrapping up.
There looks like there is the one in here in the Q&A. Parent wants to know, what is a parent's right if Child Protective Services and the Department of Education gang up on the parent with a child with a disability who is a minority in a segregated school system? Leslie, that's a big one.
I rarely say this, because if we went back through my assumptions, I would tell you that ordinary citizens are as powerful as lawyers. But in this particular subject, I would tell you to get a lawyer. Really, I don't know your state, but once you have a district who's in cahoots with Child Protective Services, you probably can't see, everybody can't see, but I've got, air quotes going on. Who Child Protective Services is protecting, and it's normally a system and not a child. But when you have these 2 entities together and you have a family who doesn't have, access to a lot of power within that community, I do think you want to call, see if you can find a family attorney or legal aid or somebody to walk you through some of those pieces. That's particularly worrisome.
Thanks for flagging that. That may have just gone to you because I don't see it, but I'm glad we were able to.
Retaliation is real.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, it is.
The retaliation is real. And one of the things that it does happen, I think that's important that we say retaliation is happening. And a lot of the times it's already happened before you really get involved in advocating. I noticed that a lot of times certain kids are picked on by certain staff. They just like stand out for whatever reason. And my position with my clients that are experiencing that is acknowledge, yes, you're being retaliated against. That's what it is. And what we can do to address that, the things that we can do to protect you from further retaliation is, let's document what's happened. Show how, after you did or took an action or made a request, that the behaviors between of the staff changed towards you or changed towards your child. And then you document that, you put that in writing and you say, I noticed a change in behaviors towards me that feels retaliatory ever since I hired an advocate, requested an IEP meeting, appealed a suspension, whatever the action is. And then sending it, whoever is doing the retaliation, you got to send it to the next level, because you're asking that person has the authority to stop it, to investigate it, to fix it. And putting that kind of stuff in writing as you go through the processes can be used later on, right? If it gets bigger, if they don't change their behaviors, you continue to document, and then you submit an Office of Civil Rights complaint. Advocacy is not for the shy, you know. You gotta, parents have to build some thick skin while healing. So it's really tough because they're in that trauma state usually, right? So it's hard to maneuver. I think we have to acknowledge that, but telling, a lot of times, allowing the parent to feel that and letting them know that it's safe to feel that is the start of them healing and finding their strength in this journey. It's my suggestion. That's what I have to.
Ms. Ellen, I see your hand up. I think you're.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kudo what Dr. Poe said about starting to document when things start to change. But the other thing that should be available to that parent in every state, don't we have a PA? You know, we have attorneys who should be representing families that they can reach out to, because to say to a family in Holmes County, find an attorney, it's not going to happen. The other thing is, and of course, you know, I'm leery of this, but I think families working with an advocate, particularly when you have Department of Human Services and school district, sometimes children are in need of a guardian ad litem. And so you go to family court and you have the family judge give that child an attorney who will protect the rights of that child, whose only interest is the rights of that child. Because school districts, you know, when social services steps in, you know, because oftentimes in our communities, we have to wear them out too, because they don't participate in the level that we need them to. But when they become involved, oftentimes it is not in support of the family. It's part of the system. They're part of that system. So again, you know, parent, take some more warriors up in that meeting with you. Reach out to the PA in your state and find out if there is an attorney who can represent your needs and interests. And even if that attorney cannot come, that attorney should be willing to work with the advocate in that family to lay out some strategies until they can come on and be present. So I just wanted to lift that up. And this has really, really been good. I forgot how much fun it is advocating for children with disabilities. You know, that's the fight. Oh yeah.
That's it now.
Really, I appreciate it. And thank you, Natalie, for bringing this up.
Thank you. Thanks to our speakers, Cheryl Poe and Leslie Lipson. We are wrapping up like exactly on time, which is wonderful. And I thank you to the interpreters who provided interpretation into Spanish. As I shared in the chat a few times, the links to the slides. And as I said, we'll also post this to our YouTube page and share it out as a video. And then it sounds like we also have some ideas about some additional resources that we can create as DSC stemming from some of these conversations. So thank you so much for joining. And I think we can wrap it up, and I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.